I'm going to actually jump a little bit behind the scene on this one. There are very few races that are older than Elder, and the Dajrel are one of them. In this installment, they are referred to as Darklings as well as other things due to Kayla's lack of understanding of what they actually are. They're actually rather nasty little critters. They're discussed a little bit more in the next installment. But I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of behind the scenes here. These things are actually congealed to primordial darkness, or at least used to serve primordial darkness, which makes them insanely old. Here we go. Now let's get this crap out of our way and get to the main installment.
Chapter 41. After parting ways, the ancient weaver had vanished into the nebula, ferrying the corpse of the old queen to her final resting place. She could feel a deep longing shared among the inhabitants of the ship which had retrieved her. They were members of a third species which were prominent within the hive, but far less numerous than the insectal clether. Much like Gauri's race, the Sirvani, these creatures weren't native to Keralis, but had come from some other dimension. Then again, it wasn't clear that they were truly in this one. They each cast dark shadows wherever they moved, and bore a powerful mental presence, yet seemed to lack any physical form. These strange creatures, born of darkness, had sent a corvette-class ship to carry her back to her own people, along with an escort of 3 Cletharian heavy fighters. Callie could feel the minds of the fighter pilots. They were Clether and were fiercely devoted to the protection of the baby weaver that had accepted Callie as its surrogate mother. She had been sealed inside an airlock from the moment they'd parted ways with the massive weaver, along with several of the strange creatures. The air contained within the airlock was from within the nautiloid's shell. The environment within the rest of the ship could be completely inhospitable to more conventional life forms, or the shadowy creatures simply didn't trust her enough to allow her to board. She couldn't interpret their reasons or motives, and attempting to communicate, pointless. They couldn't understand her any more than she could understand them. None of this made any sense to her. She'd heard their song when they were part of the collective, but now she couldn't even understand the thoughts of the Clether. The difference was obvious. The old queen no longer stood at the heart of the telepathic web that had bound Callie's mind to the collective. She had no shared language with any of these creatures any more than with the queen. Something else had been in play. Callie's thoughts were interrupted by the realization that Kayla knew the answer, but was withholding it for some reason. Kivaza had certainly hidden away things from her sister's soul in the past, so it seemed hypocritical to resent Kayla for doing the same. Explaining why taking the 20 stones from the corners of the dodecahedron room was so important to her other self would have been nice, but no answer was provided. Kayla seemed to be withholding most of what she'd learned from spending time with the old queen. Memories sealed away from Kivaza weren't accessible to Callie. While intrigued by this opportunity to understand the inner workings of the Cletharian hive, she had the impression that there was no rush to unravel the mysteries that lay ahead. Had there been any urgency, Kayla wouldn't be playing guessing games with Kivaza. A loud clank echoed through the small chamber as they docked. "Where have you taken me?" Callie asked, as if the dark was capable of answering. The outer airlock door spiraled open, revealing a more conventional doorway just beyond the seal. A dense, flexible membrane held the two structures together. Outer hatch doors were normally designed to interlock, so they would open in unison. However, this ship's design was incompatible with that standard. It was certainly inconvenient, but not at all surprising. The Cletharians were known for many things, but diplomatic missions weren't on that list. Opening the door would be a lot easier if Tyrell or Shinji were with her. Callie sighed deeply. She reached out with her mind, searching for her crew. It didn't take long to find Gowrie and the twins. They were close. Jake was harder to locate due to the vast differences of his alien neurology. He wasn't with the others, and she suspected Syntholo was with him but, due to the nature of his abilities, was unable to confirm her assumption. She expanded her consciousness further as she searched for Shinji. The further she tried to reach, the more she could feel the young weaver's presence. Have I unwittingly been bound by my own collection of dogmas, Callie mused. Have I misjudged the very foundations of what knacks are, and how they work? Callie reached out to the nautiloid and gently caressed the creature's mind. She could feel the dense rope-like cords that bound the creature to every other weaver throughout Corellis. She could feel the cords that connected to the minds of the strange creatures of darkness and the Clether. Seeking further, she could feel the thin thready strands that connected to the minds of the nearby members of her crew. Further beyond that, the twiny connection that intersected with Shinji's consciousness, and another strand that was close to Shinji. She reached out to the second cord, but recoiled immediately. Reaching out toward Tyrell's mind was painful in a way she couldn't quite express, yet it reminded her of the moment when she'd been struck by lightning at the ruins of the Nadrock colony. They were far from her current location, but were growing closer. The young weaver's consciousness recoiled from her in fear. The creature had felt the same thing she had, and was afraid. I really should name you, Callie thought as she tried to soothe the frightened infant's mind, but first I need to get through this door and find my friends. She felt thoughts passing through the young weaver and into the nearby Clether and Darklings. Darklings, Callie mused as she watched the shadowy forms shifting near her. I suppose it's as good a name as any. It's certainly descriptive enough, even if it does lack originality. The dark shadows cast by the intangible Darklings continued to gather against the thickly armored hatchway. I doubt they care what we call them, Callie chuckled softly. I wonder what they call us. The shadows seemed to draw back from the center of the door, but instead of the metal hatch being revealed, she could see into the structure with which they had docked. It seemed to be a more advanced variation of Syntholo's shadow manipulation. Callie stepped through the passage, drawing her tails through the opening behind her. The portal closed swiftly, yet a shadowy patch remained with her on this side of the door. While it was possible that the Darkling merely miscalculated, she suspected it had deliberately chosen to follow her. Being chosen the successor by the former queen really wasn't enough. Callie would have to earn the respect of the collective. As the Darkling corvette drew away from the airlock, the strength of the connection between her unseen passenger and the rest of the dark creatures neither weakened nor faltered. They were all bound into a collective, much like the Clether and the Weavers. The only hive mind Callie knew of, that wasn't part of Cletheria, were the Xenon. She'd been told that when one of the smallish insectal creatures leaves the hives their enemy are clipped to separate them from the rest of their race. Could this be to insulate and protect them from the influence of the various Cletherian species? Callie scowled as she felt a wave of negative emotion passing through the Darklings. They clearly didn't like the Xenons. Her thoughts were still being filtered through and translated by the young weaver. She gently began withdrawing her consciousness from the nautiloid's mind, but stopped abruptly as she felt fear welling up deep within the young creature's mind. It felt so lost, isolated, and alone that Callie felt as if her heart was going to break. She reached out to soothe the baby weaver with her mind. It was clearly as dependent and demanding as any other infant would be. It needed her, and if that meant allowing the Clether and Darklings to listen in on her every secret thought and desire, so be it. There was no sign of the door she'd passed through. The inner side of the door matched the plain, white, unadorned hallway which she'd stepped into. It curved to her right and left. A darkened patch of floor was her only indication that one of the Darklings was still with her. She continued down the curved corridor for some time before becoming frustrated. Wait here, she thought toward the darkling, but it continued to follow her. Well, that didn't work, Callie snickered, then reached out through the nautiloid, following the slender strands until she found the link that connected the young creature to her darkling companion. Wait here, she urged, allowing her thoughts to be filtered through the Weaver's consciousness. She continued walking, but this time the dark patch didn't follow. Before long she saw the darkened patch of ground again, this time in front of her. The hallway had no visible doors. If I ever find out who designed the ship. Callie grumbled as her tails thumped against the floor irritably. The darkling began moving toward her. Did it respond to the sound of my tails, the change in my emotional state, or something else entirely? Sometimes it seemed like all she had was questions. At least she'd have an opportunity to learn about them while they studied her. If she adjusted her eyes, she'd be able to perceive the flow of energies around her. It would, likely, reveal any doorways which would normally be imperceptible without the visual acuity of a child of Elderon. Just as she was about to narrow her eyes, she paused. Would she be able to see the creature once she shifted her perceptual range? Was it ready to be seen? The act suddenly felt like it would be an intrusion, although she couldn't explain why, or how she'd gotten that impression. Perhaps it had sensed her intentions and routed its feeling through the nautiloid as Callie had earlier. She allowed her thoughts and feelings to pass through the Weaver. If you don't want me to use my eyes, the least you could do is show me where the door is. The black mass cascaded upward along the inner wall, then flowed away from her. Callie sped down the corridor, staying just behind the darkened patch, and nearly lost her footing when it stopped abruptly. You're kidding, Callie scoffed. We were within 10 yards of the door, and I couldn't even tell. A patch of utter darkness shone against the base of the wall. Lighter shadows traced the outline of the unseen doorway, like shadows cast from a person standing still in the midst of moving rays of light. Yet, there was a strange fluid quality to the movements across the wall which was reminiscent of some dark liquid gathering in geometric pools before passing into shallow tributaries. It was almost hypnotic. A sudden, powerful burst of energy knocked Callie back against the outer wall. There was a loud clank as a section of wall recessed a few inches. A little warning would have been nice, she scolded as she stood back up and stepped forward. The door rolled to the side, revealing a rounded passage leading deeper into the structure at a slight incline. Callie wished that she'd been able to see the energy the creature had been manipulating. The force that had struck her didn't feel like it was telekinetic in nature. The darkling moved to the side, waited until she entered the passage, then resumed its position behind her as she continued on her way. Without turning to look behind her, she was beginning to develop a general sense of where it was in relation to herself. It wasn't the same as when she used her psionic abilities to sense nearby minds, more like the feeling of being watched that everyone experiences, even those lacking a knack for telepathy. The feeling seemed to be growing stronger the longer she spent in the creature's presence. Way to make a girl paranoid, Callie snickered as she approached the doorway at the end of the hallway. She was momentarily relieved to see that this door had an actual control console, but hesitated before pushing the button. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. The exits within the outer docking ring had been well hidden but would have been obvious to a cyberpath. This passage ended with a metallic seal which encircled the entire doorway. These structures had been used and possibly designed by the same person or people who had hacked Tyrell's brain. It was probable that the ship, or facility, that she docked with was designed by and for cyberpaths. Why would they need a button? She regarded the button with suspicion. It had to be a trap. She'd have to find another way to open the door. A soft hissing noise sounded as the door opened slightly. The darkling's shadow sped past her, through the narrow crack in the door. I guess I'm not the only one that feels like a rat in a maze, Callie snickered. For large, black, clawed hands reached into the narrow slit between the door panels. For a moment she wondered if the darkling had become tangible. "Don't force it," Jake said with an urgency which his translator was unable to convey. "I haven't finished bypassing the security release." "But Mama is trapped," Ziku objected. Callie grinned at the sound of his voice. Her boys had come to rescue her. Sometimes they really were good kids. "Ziku, Yari," Kayla said firmly, "wait for Jake to finish. Patience is important. Brute force isn't always the answer. I've been trying to teach the two of you to not act impulsively. You must always take a moment to analyze the situation before acting, or you're likely to make matters worse." "Sorry, Mama," they said in unison as they withdrew their hands from the door. "Hey, Jake," Callie said, "what would have happened if I hit this button?" "Nothing good," Jake said. The explosive bolts would have been triggered, which would have decoupled the docking ring. You'd be floating, unprotected, in space right now. She stepped further away from the button. "Just take your time," she said nervously. "I can wait." She lost track of time while she waited for Jake to bypass the systems which were intended to kill potential intruders. The twins had been overcome by boredom and left for some other area time earlier, and Callie had nearly dozed off twice herself. "Are you still there?" she asked after yawning. "I feel like I'm missing something," he replied. "I'm taking a quick break. You know what they say about compound eyes?" "No," Callie chuckled, "I really don't." Jake laughed. "I suppose you wouldn't. It's a joke shared among some insectal races. It's of little importance. I'd rather not take any unnecessary risks, so I'm resting my eyes." "What's the joke?" "When you strain compound eyes, you end up with a compound headache. It's not that funny. You'd understand it if you had my eyes," Jake chittered. "If you say so," Callie said with a shrug. "Do you have any idea how much longer this is going to take?" "I think I've been done for about 10 minutes now," Jake said, "but I feel like I've forgotten something important. Considering the potential consequences, I just want to be sure before I make the last connection." The Darkling was unwilling, or unable, to make a portal through the door on its own. "Is Syntholo there with you?" Callie asked. "No. Shadow walking wasn't an option." Even if she were to ask the Darkling to cast a long enough shadow, she wasn't confident she could do it without Syntholo's guidance. "Here comes trouble," Jake said. "What's wrong?" Callie asked urgently. "Do you need me to contact the Cletharians for help?" Jake paused for a moment before answering. "As tempting as that may be, I think I'd prefer his wrath to yours." "What do you mean?" Callie asked as she heard the faint rumble of a ship's engines. There was no reply. "What's going on out there?" Callie yelled over the sound of the landing thrusters, then chuckled in amusement. Even if he had tried to respond, she wouldn't have been able to hear him. His translation module had a preset volume level. She grinned broadly as the adjoining room fell silent. She could sense Shinji nearby, but he didn't have the skills required to pilot a ship, which meant... "So, trashing my ship wasn't enough for you," Tyrell roared. "You may be a good surgeon, but you're no technician. Step away from that circuit board before you do any more damage." She felt as if her heart had skipped a beat at the sound of his voice. She'd expected Syntholo was at the helm. Clearly, a lot had happened while she was visiting the Cletharians. "Lady Darkseid is trapped on the other side of this door," Jake said. "I'm trying to open it without triggering the anti-intrusion system." "Is that what you think you were doing?" Tyrell mocked. "You've pulled up 3 deck plates, pulled up half the wires, and all you've managed to accomplish is disconnect the hallway monitoring system and bypass the circuits that disable the subroutine that detaches the docking ring from the main shuttle bay." Those wires are linked to the explosive bolts, not the cameras, Jake scoffed. I double-checked the schematic. I know what I'm doing here. Don't be an idiot, Tyrell growled. Cyberpaths don't need blueprints to understand how systems are connected. Do you think that someone talented enough to get the better of me would provide an instruction manual that would allow any 2-bit hack to circumvent their countermeasures? I never thought I'd have to accuse you of being too trusting. This isn't like the regicide one. This ship was designed by cyberpaths for cyberpaths. If you find any information on the computer that would be useful to shipyard technicians, it's a trap set for anyone dumb enough to try and play with someone else's toys. Please stop bickering, Shinji said forcefully. Lady Darkseid is still trapped in there. I don't care who opens the door, just open it. If I miss something, show me what, Jake said. This just isn't a problem you can solve, Tyrell scoffed. The explosive bolts are on a separate subsystem that's not normally accessible from inside the ship. I can get to it easily enough, but that's because I am a cyberpath. Callie could hear someone approaching the door. Tyrell? Callie asked. Is that you? I'll have you out of there in no time, Tyrell reassured her from the other side of the door. What would have happened if I'd just liquefied the door and walked through it? Callie asked. I know forcing the doors would have set off the trap, Tyrell said, but I'm not sure if that would have worked. It's a matter of if the signal through the doors got interrupted, but if you moved fast enough it might have worked. Well, as long as the door was closed completely. Of course, if you did interrupt that signal you would have depressurized the main bay and vented the atmosphere into space. The door opened. Callie rushed through the door and embraced Tyrell. All I did was open a door, he said with surprise. I thought we lost you, she said as she fought back tears. Keep squeezing me like that, and you just might, he wheezed. Sorry, Callie whispered in a shuddering voice as she loosened her hold on him. I'm here, Tyrell said softly as he finally hugged her back. I'm sorry I scared you. I'm just glad you were able to find a way to sever his connection. Do you know who it was? Callie asked. We can talk about that later, he said. You can let go of me now. She buried her face in his shirt and shook her head. I'm not letting go. I really wish you would, he said as he shifted uncomfortably. What's wrong? She asked as she pulled away from him. I don't want it to sound like I'm not enjoying this tearful reunion, he said and then cleared his throat, but why aren't you wearing your environment suit? The Cletharians tore it off me before I went to see the Queen. Tyrell smirked as he looked her up and down. Oh. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking, Callie blushed, realizing what he meant. Apparently not, he teased as he offered her his coat. Feel free to ask Pinky to hug me like that anytime, but you are my boss. Just don't do that again. Thank you, she said sheepishly as she took it from him and wrapped the chameleon coat around herself. Just make sure I get it back, Tyrell snickered. That was payment for the first job I ever did for you, after all. I forgot you had it. She smiled. I just wish I'd been wearing it when we first passed through this area, he said and then turned to glare at Jake. It might have saved my ship from being butchered. I did what had to be done, Jake retorted. Are you sure you don't still need this? The main transmitter is down for now. I saw to that, Tyrell said. I was told I started coming to my senses after the relays were taken out, so I put on my coat and I came over here with the kid. We'll just have to go back later to get what's left of my ship. What do you mean your ship? Callie asked irritably as she looked around the bay. She wished the Darkling ship had been fitted with some kind of viewport so she could have gotten a look at the object they'd docked with. She'd assumed it was a ship, but from within the main dock, she wasn't so sure. The vast chamber was encircled by a tall, white, featureless wall. Far above, she could see a round, flat object which looked like it matched the circumference of the aperture far above them. She could see the soft light of the nebula through the gap between the two structures. They'd arrived in the small fighter they had purchased for Syntholo's use. It looked like roughly 2/3 of its bulk had been absorbed by the floor. The boarding hatch had been submerged completely. "I don't understand," Callie said in confusion. "How did that happen, and how did you get out?" Shinji grunted as he started helping Jake move the detached deck plates back into the proper positions. "It's a technology I've never even heard of," Tyrell admitted. "Like I said, the ship was designed for cyberpaths. If you don't have the knack for it, you're not going anywhere once you land. All I had to do was send an instruction to the material to make a ramp. It's some kind of reactive polymer. I'm more interested in how the others managed to get on board." A dull clank echoed through the dock as Tyrell and Shinji released the deck plate. "We did it the old-fashioned way," Jake said. "We lined up the shuttle airlock with the hull and burned our way through." "Please, tell me you didn't trash that ship too," Tyrell said with a heavy sigh. "It's not that bad," Jake said dismissively. "The twins were very helpful. They're really taking to their training, but I'm not sure where we'd be here if Syntholo hadn't been directing them. Yari fused us to the hull, then weakened it enough for Ziku to punch through." "You have that backward," Callie corrected. "Ziku is the one that can manipulate the elements." "I guess I did," Jake said, then a succession of beeps came from his translator. He paused and made the strange clicking noise she'd come to recognize as laughter before continuing. "There is an expression among my people. While it can't be directly translated into your language, the meaning is, a mother knows her own. The least you can do is try to remember that Yari can use Kobe Tomj and Ziku has a knack for mystrionics. That's easy enough." "Cut him some slack," Shinji said with a grin. "At least he's trying to remember names, and not." Jake's disdain was so strong that Callie wondered if Tyrell was able to feel it. "It was a joke," Shinji objected. "I performed dissections because it was my job," Jake's translator recited. "Do not mistake the competent performance of an assigned task or scientific curiosity with beep." Jake clenched his fists in frustration as she struggled to find an appropriate term for what he was attempting to convey. "Enjoyment?" Tyrell asked. "No," Jake said, "but that word is as good as any other in your language." "I'd imagine it's something closer to Eikshad," Callie said with a shrug. Jake tilted his head to the side and said, "I do not know that word. It does not sound like it's from a Terran tongue." "It's much older than that," Callie said. "It's from the Elder tongue and can't be translated reliably. The Johnny were able to perceive sound waves, and without being able to see the shape the sounds made, the word had no clear meaning." "Not like that," Jake said. "The word has a clear meaning, but would take too long to explain. I suddenly feel like we're, quite literally, arguing semantics," Tyrell chuckled. Callie turned her attention to Shinji. "Why are you still over there?" He glanced downward and then back up at her. "I'm still recovering, remember?" She bit her lip and said, "So, you're well enough for moving around deck plates, but not well enough to give me a hug?" He scowled. The sorrow of the collective had been far too intense. She would rather a big fluffy Jagaltim hug, but craved the feeling of being connected to the people around her. The Darkling was nowhere to be seen, but it had to be lurking in a shadow somewhere nearby. "If you're that eager for another hug," Tyrell teased, "I'm sure there are a few people on board that would be happy to oblige." Callie flashed him a disapproving glance. "Where is my ship now?" "Still parked just inside the nebula," Shinji said. "Apparently our mighty cyberpath can't pilot a ship without computer assistance." "Yeah," Tyrell said with a wary smile, "we'll just have to ask Syntholo to provide the valet service." Jake locked down the final deck plate. Where's everyone else? Shinji asked. That's what I'd like to know, Tyrell said with a crooked grin. There are so many subsystems accessible from here that I wouldn't know where to start. Some of them are obvious, like the landing platform and docking ring access doors, but those systems are localized. I'll need to access the central core to get a feel for how all these systems are integrated. I need to isolate the primary control software, decompile it, and get a good look at the source code. Callie's tails stirred restlessly. I'm usually able to fake it, she grumbled, but I have no idea what you're talking about. I need direct computer access to understand how this ship works, Tyrell grinned. That's your problem, Jake said as he started walking toward a silvery platform in the center of the docking area. You're operating under the assumption that you're on the ship. It's a segmented structure, Tyrell scoffed, but the core should still be accessible from here. It's not, Jake's amusement was unmistakable. It's an auxiliary structure. If I were to equate the design to biology, this entire structure would lie on the peripheral nervous system. I'm a cyberpath, not a biologist, Tyrell snickered. Jake cursed quietly before answering. It's like hooking up a printer to a computer. The computer can use the printer, but the printer can't access the computer. That shouldn't matter, Tyrell objected. I should still be able to get to the computer through the device's I/O access port. There's always a degree of two-way communication. This isn't just firewalled. I can't even isolate the routing to find the data port they're using to establish the connection. I'm a doctor, not a cyberpath, Jake said as he neared the platform. Either you understand my analogy, or you do not. Come over here, and I'll bring you to the ship. They all walked over to where Jake was standing. With what you did to the Regicide one, Tyrell grumbled, I expected you to have a better understanding of how ship computers work. I just treat the electronic components like they're part of the ship's biology, Jake shrugged. It's like performing a bypass. I'm not a technician. I noticed, Tyrell mocked. If he thinks that's bad, Callie taunted, wait until he sees the changes you made to the shuttle. Chapter 41